Why do Christians believe that Jesus was God? You know, this is the $60 million question, because that's what differentiates Christianity from Islam. Muslims believe that Jesus was just a prophet. That's what, in fact, differentiates Christianity from every other religion. Every other religion has their founder, be it Muhammad or Buddha or whoever, but they're just human beings, just religious teachers. Christians, on the other hand, believe that Jesus wasn't just a rabbi, wasn't just a religious leader, but was actually God himself in flesh, walking and talking, stepping into human history so we might know what he was like. Why do Christians believe that? Well, it's interesting. If you ask that question historically, what's fascinating is that when we look back through history to the early century of the Christian church, every Christian group that we know of that has left a footprint on the historical record worshipped Jesus. In fact, it's interesting, when the Romans were persecuting Christians in the first few centuries of the Christian church, they'd figured this out. They knew that was what made Christians distinct, and the way they decided if somebody was a Christian or not was they would ask them to curse Jesus and worship the Roman emperor instead, and if the person refused, then that was the death sentence. Romans knew that it was worship of Jesus that marked out Christians as unique. As you read the New Testament documents left by the early Christians, you see the early Christians worshipped Jesus. They prayed to Jesus. They called upon Jesus for salvation. They believed that healings took place in his name. In other words, they treated Jesus exactly as if he were God himself. So now we are faced with a dilemma. We have to ask the question, why did the early Christians do this? Why did they worship Jesus and treat him as if he were a god? Only two possibilities stand in front of us. Either this teaching goes back to Jesus himself, or it doesn't. And of course, if it doesn't, it makes Jesus the world's worst religious teacher in history. He didn't intend people to believe he was God, but he somehow failed to communicate to that to his followers, and they all worshipped him anyway. So, does the belief that Jesus was more than a human being go back to Jesus himself? Well, now things get very interesting, because when you read the Gospels, those four biographies of Jesus that you can find in the New Testament, you discover that in page after page after page, Jesus made claims and taught things about himself that suggested either he believed he was God, or else he was horrendously deceived or an outright liar. Take the earliest gospel, the earliest biography of Jesus we have, the book of Mark, that some secular historians say you can date to as early as the 30s or the 40s AD. Other scholars put it perhaps 10 or 20 years later, but certainly within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. You read Mark's gospel, and in Mark chapter 2, there's a wonderful story there of Jesus healing a paralytic who's been brought to him. But before he heals him, Jesus turns to this young man lying on his mat and says to him, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And all of the religious leaders there go nuts. How can Jesus claim to forgive sins? They say, only God can forgive sins. And Jesus has a bit of fun with them, actually. He turns to them and says, well, which is easier? To say to this man, your sins are forgiven, or to say you are healed, get up and walk? Or to show you that I have the authority to forgive sins, take your mat, get up and walk? And he heals the guy on the spot to demonstrate the authority he has to do something only God had the permission to do, to forgive sins. We turn a chapter or so on in Mark's Gospel, and we discover that Jesus claims to be Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was the holiest day in Judaism, the sacred holy day of the Jewish people. And the Jews believed it was a holy, sacred day because it went right back to creation when God set up the structure of time and space and the calendar. And for Jesus to say, as he casually does in Mark chapter 3, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, is tantamount to Jesus saying, I am the Lord of space and time and history. And again, the religious leaders went nuts. They accused him of blasphemy, but Jesus made the claim nevertheless. And as you read on in the Gospels, you discover Jesus does this time and time again. He makes exalted claims about himself. He claimed to have authority over the Jewish scriptures. And his famous Sermon on the Mount, he said things like, you have heard that it was said, and he quotes the Old Testament. And then he says, but I say to you, and he puts his own teaching into the mix. And again, putting his own words on the authority with God's. And then finally, all of these themes, which you can see on page after page of the Gospels, come together when Jesus is on trial for his life before the high priest Caiaphas, who's tasked with finding out whether Jesus is a blasphemer. And the high priest turns to Jesus and says, are you the Son of the Most High? In other words, are you the Son of God? And rather than say, no, you've got it all wrong, that's not what I'm saying, Jesus actually quotes a passage from the Old Testament to him, takes a divine title from the Old Testament and applies it to himself, and basically says in very, very Jewish terms to Caiaphas, yes, it's exactly as you say. And Caiaphas, so stunned by this, the high priest rips his robes in two, cries blasphemy, and sends Jesus away to be executed. So Jesus makes these claims on page after page. He makes them in the face of the authorities, and he is so confident in his identity as more than just a human being that he's willing, even when faced with death for making that claim, to follow it through and then go to the cross to carry out that mission that he believed he had come to do. And perhaps one of the most beautiful examples of this, finally, on the pages of John's Gospel, Jesus is asked by one of his disciples, Philip, says to him in John 14, he says, Jesus, can you show us God the Father? Jesus looks at him tenderly and says, Philip, have I been with you for so long that you haven't figured out who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen God the Father. And so it's claims like that, it's teaching like that. That's why Christians believe that Jesus is far more than a human being, why for 2,000 years of human history we've worshipped him and followed him as Lord and God. And the message at the heart of the Christian faith is, if you want to know what God is like, take a look at Jesus Christ.